Good morning, folks. Are we locked up? Welcome back to the first time we've been indoors in worship in a year and a half. How does that make you feel?
Woo!
On this eve of All Hallows, God calls us out of darkness and into light. Jesus is the light that we follow, the light that is true love for one another. Let us walk in the light of love. I invite you to repeat that with me. Let us walk in the light of love. One more time. Let us walk in the light of love.
I'll bring
enter this space of worship this morning, God, this safe space with no fear and no judgment, God. It is your space of love and safety, a space to not be judged, a space to not judge others, a space of just being one with you together. Fill our hearts with the light of your love this morning. How great you are, God. How great you are. And all God's people say together, amen. And can we just celebrate the sound of love and life echoing through the room? How great God is. Scripture reading this morning comes from John's Gospel, reading chapter 3, verses 19 through 20. Let us listen to the word of God. And this is the judgment, that the light has come into the world, and people loved darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil. For all who do evil hate the light and do not come to the light, so that their deeds may not be exposed. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So, today is a fun day, especially if you have little kids in your house or little kids in your neighborhood. Today, of course, is Halloween. So, I want to ask you first of all, as we start, what's your favorite Halloween costume? Either your favorite one that you've admired, or your favorite one that you've ever worn, that you like for yourself or saw on somebody else. What's your favorite Halloween costume? You can define favorite however you want. Vampire! Vampire is a fun one. Anybody else? Favorite Halloween costume? I actually want you to answer out loud. Even with your masks on, you can still answer me out loud. What's your favorite Halloween costume? Vampire or any other? Witch. Yeah? Cowboy. Cowboy. Sorry? Sorry. Wearing a mask. Cowboy with a mask. Cowboy, vampire, witch. I think we had a couple of witches there. I think we had multiple votes for witch. Any others? Favorite costume for Halloween? A rat. That would be funny.
Jack Skeleton.
Sorry?
Jack Skeleton.
Skeleton. Oh, a skeleton, yeah. See, these are horrible for public speaking, aren't they? A what skeleton?
Jack Skeleton. Nightmare Before Christmas.
Jack Skeleton? Oh, okay. I saw a hilarious one yesterday. A friend of mine posted a picture of her elementary school age son who was testing out his costume for today, and he's dressed as an anti-masker. He's got a mask with some sort of slogan written on it about how he's being oppressed and has to be forced by the government to wear a mask, and a t-shirt with the same thing on it. It was hilarious. Yeah, I think probably witches are probably the one costume we most often associate with Halloween. I mean, we have witches and warlocks and ghouls and goblins, but I think when we think of Halloween, a witch is probably the most common image that comes to our mind, or the first image that comes to our mind. So where does that come from? Where does Halloween come from? Where do the witches come from? Why does this day exist? Well, Halloween, as you may know, the word is really a contraction of All Hallows Eve. And All Hallows Eve is the eve, the day before All Hallows Day, otherwise known as All Saints Day. And we all know the value of remembering people who have passed on. I think everybody here has probably attended at least one, if not many, funerals in their lives where we give thanks to God for the life of a person, and we remember a person who meant something important to us. Well, over the history of the church, certain people became identified as almost heroes of the church, and the church wanted to remember them, and they called them saints. And they set aside days to remember those saints, and different days in the calendar were set aside as certain saints' days to celebrate and remember that saint. And after a while, after generations of doing that, setting aside days to remember certain saints, they got to the point where there were more saints than there were days in the calendar. So somebody came up with the great idea, why don't we have one day during the whole year where we remember and celebrate all the saints at once, instead of giving each one their own individual day. And so eventually November 1st emerged as the day in common that the church chose to celebrate and remember all of those saints. And by about the mid-19th century, it had become official in what was then the Roman Catholic Church, our ancestors. It became official that November 1st was the day each and every year where we would set aside for All Saints' Day to remember all the saints of the church who had passed before us. And the word hallow, if you use it as a verb, it just means to make something holy. If you use hallow as a noun, it refers to a holy person. So All Hallows Day and All Saints Day mean the same thing. It's synonymous. There was another day of celebration in a different tradition around that same time amongst a people who predated the Christians in Ireland, Scotland, and pre-Roman England. And they celebrated a festival called Samhain. And you may have seen that word and puzzled at how do you actually pronounce that? It's not Samhain. That's how it would look in English, but in Gaelic it's actually pronounced Samhain. And Samhain is the pre-Christian Gaelic celebration of the end of the harvest. So roughly equivalent to our Thanksgiving, but the timing was a little different. It was also a recognition of the time of entering into the season of darkness. So not the darkest day of the year, that comes in December, but the beginning of the season of darkness. And the Celtic measurement of time was actually very similar to the old Jewish measurement of time, which meant that the day ended at sunset and the next day started at sunset. Our concept of day and night transferring over, or yesterday to today, it's transferring over at midnight and to tomorrow at midnight, was foreign to them. They lived by the sun, and when the sun went down, that was the end of the day, the current day and the beginning of the next day. And the ancient Jews measured time exactly the same way. So their celebration of Samhain began at sunset and continued through to what we would call the next day, but in their mind was the same day. As the Christians moved into their lands, they felt the need to take over that festival and appropriate it for themselves. And why is that? Well, it is because they had an empire to uphold, an empire to build. And when you are building an empire, the Roman Empire at the time, as you're building an empire and expanding your empire, it necessarily involves conquering people. And if you're going to be conquering people and keeping them in your empire, and you want them to be peaceful, then you need to figure out a way to look after them. If you're an emperor, your greatest fear in your empire is that there's going to be uprisings and people rebelling against you. And so the Romans did everything they could to try and keep the peace with the people that they had conquered. And this comes up in our own Christian story around Palm Sunday and the anxiety that the Romans felt as Jesus came riding into town on the donkey and upsetting the peace of the celebration and provoking people to possible trouble. So if you want to keep people at peace and you've conquered them, one of the best ways to pacify them and make them peaceful is to incorporate what's important to them into your empire society. So you would take their traditions and absorb their traditions into your own, and then they feel like they can still celebrate their traditions. But empire also needs a thread of uniformity to it. So you have to have a unified culture in an empire, or it's just going to fracture and fall apart, and you won't be able to hold the empire together. So you've got to bring those two things into tension if you want to keep the peace in an empire. So you take the traditions of the people that you conquered, and you keep parts of it, but you change the meanings of it to incorporate it into your unified empire culture. And that helps keep the peace. So take those old traditions and give them new meaning. In the 4th century, the empire became Christian. Christianity became the official religion of the empire. So as the empire spread, it wasn't simply spreading Roman culture, it was spreading Christianity and imposing it by force on conquered people. And so the empire and Christianity as a belief system became one and the same. And the survival of the empire became intimately tied with the necessary imposition of Christianity on conquered peoples. And as the Celtic peoples were being conquered in what's now France and England, and they never quite made it into Scotland. They tried, but the Scots beat them back. As they were moving into those Celtic lands, they encountered this celebration of Samhain. And they culturally appropriated it into their Christian celebrations around the same day of All Hallows Day and All Hallows Eve. And so they kept the traditions of dressing up for the celebration. They kept those traditions, but changed their meanings to fit into the Christian culture. Much the same way they did with the Yuletide traditions that we now associate with Christmas. I mean, after all, what in the world does an evergreen tree have to do with the birth of Jesus? Absolutely nothing. It's a part of the pagan celebration of Yuletide that we culturally appropriated and incorporated into the Christian tradition to pacify the conquered people. Among those conquered peoples, both in the German areas and also in the Celtic areas, but especially in the Celtic areas, they encountered a view of the roles of men and women that were different from what they knew in Roman culture. Ancient Celts understood the role of women differently. Women were allowed to be soldiers in the Celtic culture. Women were allowed to be generals, commanding armies among the Celts. There was one in particular, Boberg, who lived in what we now know as southern Scotland and northern England. Her husband had been king of that region, and he had made peace with the Romans as they moved in. He was formidable, and they couldn't quite conquer him, so rather than conquer him, they made a peace deal with him. They brokered a peace deal with him. When he died, the Roman emperor moved in, broke the deal, conquered the land that they had made peace with, took the king's wife, named Boberg, and their surviving daughters, treated them inappropriately, and took their lands. Boberg, in a culture where women were permitted to rise up in arms and command an army, led a massive revolt against the Romans. Her revolt is half the reason that Hadrian's Wall exists today. If you're familiar with that, on the north end of England, was to keep them out. She scared the Romans because here was a woman in charge of an army, and it was a genuine threat to them. Women in charge were dangerous. Women in charge could lead to an uprising, which if you're an emperor, that's the last thing you want. Among the similar pagan people on the continent, amongst the Celtic people, women were also not just allowed to be generals, they were also allowed to be priests, which was not permitted in Roman culture. Same amongst the Germanic people, women there were empowered to be priests. And the word that we know today as witch, we can throw witch back up there, huh? The word we now know today as witch comes from the old Germanic word Wicca, which just means wisdom. And it is the root word for where we get the modern name of a certain religion, Wiccan. If you've ever heard of the Wiccan religion, it derives from the same word. So the word witch really just means a practitioner of Wicca, or a woman who preserves wisdom, a wise woman. Far cry from what we usually associate with that image of the word witch, which in its true form just means a woman who preserves the wisdom of the culture. The Romans, after Boudicca, had a reason to be afraid of women in power and positions of leadership. They were a threat to the empire. So wise women had to be portrayed as evil. They had to be portrayed not as bearers of wisdom, but as practitioners of evil magic. the work of the devil. And it wasn't true. It was just a smear campaign to suppress their power and culturally appropriate the bits of their culture that worked and smother the rest. And they used Bible passages like the one I read today to justify that. And this is the judgment, that the light has come into the world, and people loved darkness rather than light because their deeds were evil. For all who do evil hate the light and do not come to the light, and so their deeds may not be exposed. And so they took this passage and other ones like it, and applied it to these people they had conquered and said, don't follow them, they're people of darkness, they are evil, follow our priests. The church taught people in ancient times not just to fear wise women, but to hate them as evil. And they taught by the use of Scripture that God wanted them to hate wise women and treat them as evil. Taught them you better be careful or she's going to cast a spell on you. And thus we get the image of the witch. Fast forward a little bit, the Roman Empire falls apart, and now we have the British Empire. We have good old King James, after which our King James Bible is named. King James VI of Scotland, otherwise known as King James I of Great Britain. He was a deeply religious man, but he was also very superstitious. He was very well read. He even spoke multiple languages, and he liked to study the history of ancient peoples, including the ancient Celtic peoples. He could speak fluent Gaelic. And like today, he did his research on ancient peoples, and he read enough to believe that he was right, but not enough to know that he was wrong. To quote Neil deGrasse Tyson, the problem that plagues us today, people doing their research, learning just enough to believe that they are right, but not enough to recognize that they are wrong. King James did the same thing. And he was terrified of witches. Now, this guy, probably given the situation of his life, had a good reason to be a little bit mixed up when it came to his understanding of women in power. He was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, whose head was chopped off by Queen Elizabeth I after she had been imprisoned by Elizabeth for, what was it, a decade or more, I think? I can't remember. He was a toddler when his own father was murdered and his own mother was implicated in the murder. And he inherited the throne of the woman who had executed his mother. I think his concepts of women in power might have been a little bit distorted by his childhood experiences and fueled his fear of women in power, fueled his fear of witches. James was deathly afraid of witches. And because the king was afraid of witches, if you wanted to be in the good grace of the king, you better be afraid of witches too, or at least pretend you are. And so the whole nation, the whole empire, had to become afraid of witches. And James' personal fear became everybody's fear. And thus we had the witch trials throughout Great Britain. It happened in Europe too, and it was imported here into the colonies. Thus we have the Salem witch trials, all because James was afraid of witches. As modern Christians, especially ones in the United Church who pride ourselves on being inclusive, we've learned to play nice with Roman Catholics as Protestants to Catholics in dialogue. We've learned to play nice with our Jewish neighbors as Christians and Jews in dialogue. We've learned to play nice with our Muslim neighbors as Christians and Muslims in dialogue. Because all of those folks all worship the same deity, right? There is only one God. What about the poor pagans? Why do we still see them as a threat to us? I have a handful of friends who consider themselves pagans, and they're pretty big on celebrating the divinity found in nature. Well, that sounds familiar. They're pretty big on finding meaning in darkness and light. Well, that sounds pretty familiar. They're pretty big on understanding the meaning of the passing of the seasons, both the seasons of the year and the seasons of our life. Well, that's a little different than what we have, but I'm okay with that. They're big on trees. We need to be bigger on trees. I think they've got the right idea there. There's nothing in my encounter with them that is any way challenging or threatening to what I believe about God. In fact, there's a lot of overlap in terms of respect for nature and respect for God's presence in the world everywhere. There's nothing there that I find that's contrary to my understanding of God as experienced in Jesus Christ. So what threat are they to me? Nothing. If having a conversation with someone whose views are different than mine is a threat to my beliefs, then my beliefs are pretty fragile. Any encounter I've ever had in my life with somebody who views the world differently, especially has different spiritual views than I do, I find those conversations only deepen my understanding of God. They don't threaten my understanding of God. My God isn't fragile. My God isn't weak and fragile, not so fragile as to be threatened by different worldviews. If God is real, and I believe God is real, if God is real, then God is stronger than any human belief, ours or anybody else's. What I believe, or what somebody else believes, isn't going to change God. If I'm grounding myself in the true divine source of the universe, then I have nothing to be afraid of. Which, by the way, is probably exactly how a pagan would say the same thing. How did Jesus view people of different faiths? Well, he lifted up the Samaritan as a hero. His followers embraced the Gentiles. They weren't threatened by different beliefs. They welcomed them. We need to stop trying to kill, and I mean that both literally and metaphorically. We need to stop trying to kill things we don't agree with or don't believe in. Because we're setting a pretty bad example for the world. And this is the judgment, that the light has come into the world and people loved darkness rather than light because their deeds were evil. What is the true darkness that that passage is talking about? What's the true darkness that people loved? Selfishness, fear, anger, hatred in their own hearts. That's the true darkness. That's what creates deeds of evil that that passage is speaking about. Fear of those who are different than we are is the biggest cause of evil throughout history. What is the message of light that that passage is talking about? The call by Jesus to love one another. That is the antidote to fear. Perfect love casts out fear. Perfect love casts out fear. Thanks be to God.